Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. There is a room on a small island in the middle of the Rhine. The island is called the Ile des Épées, and on the 7th of May, 1770, it contains a ceremony that has been months in the careful preparation. The room is purpose-built, a temporary pavilion divided precisely down the center, one half draped in Austrian colors, the other in French. A seam runs across the floor, a border made literal in silk and timber. On the Austrian side of that seam stands a girl of 14. Her name is Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, Archduchess of Austria, youngest daughter of the Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa. She has been prepared for this day with the same diligence her mother's court brings to the preparation of treaties, because that is, in the precise diplomatic language of the age, what she is: a treaty, a living clause in the Franco-Austrian alliance dressed in white and delivered to the opposite bank. The ceremony has a particular requirement that no one has thought to soften in the telling. Before she crosses the line, everything she brought from home must be removed. Her Austrian clothes, her Austrian attendants, her Austrian jewelry, the small dog she had carried in her lap across the Alps, everything. The protocol permitted nothing foreign to cross into France, not a ribbon, not a pocket prayer book, not the embroidered handkerchief from a lady-in-waiting who had dried her tears that morning and would not be permitted to dry them again. The girl stood on the Austrian side of the room, and she was, item by item, with the unhurried procedural efficiency of men for whom this was simply administration, unmade. The language changed, the clothes changed, the attendants changed. And when she walked across that seam in the floor into the French half of the pavilion, she carried nothing of the life she had been. She understood exactly what was being communicated. She was 14, not stupid, not unaware. She crossed the line without crying. Maria Antonia had been born in Vienna on the 2nd of November 1755, the morning after, by dark coincidence, that the Lisbon earthquake killed 60,000 people and shook the philosophical certainties of Europe. She was the 15th of Maria Theresa's 16 children, and she had grown up inside the particular liberty of that position. Important enough to be an instrument of policy, young enough to be overlooked by the daily machinery of empire. Her childhood at Schönbrunn had warmth in it. She was impractical, lively, easily distracted, a child more at home on a harpsichord bench or galloping a horse across the estate than bent over Latin primers. Her tutors reported with varying degrees of diplomacy that she was not a natural student. Her mother noted it with less diplomacy. Maria Theresa's correspondence about her youngest daughter's education is brisk with the particular impatience of a woman who has 20 years of diplomatic matchmaking to coordinate and insufficient raw material to work with. The French match was secured when Maria Antonia was 10 years old. The boy she was to marry, Louis Auguste, Dauphin of France, grandson of Louis XV, was 11. Neither of them had met. Neither would meet until she was deposited on French soil and driven through a country that lined its roads to stare at her as though she were a curiosity rather than a person. which, in the calculus of courts, was precisely what she was. Versailles. You can read descriptions of it and still not be ready for the thing itself. The Hall of Mirrors, 757 mirrors catching the garden light at an angle that makes the room feel like standing inside an argument about grandeur. The chapel, the gardens, geometry imposed on nature at a scale that required hundreds of laborers and decades, and a king's absolute conviction that the world should arrange itself according to his preference. Everything in the palace communicated the same thing, that the French monarchy did not merely hold power, it performed it, continuously, before an audience of thousands, without intermission, and every performance required props and choreography and the precise staging of rank. The levee, the morning rising of the Dauphine, later the Queen, was not a private act. It was a ceremony governed by a hierarchy so rigid that particular noblewomen held the specific right to perform particular functions, to hand her the chemise, to offer the basin of rosewater, to hold the glass, to place the shoes. The right to perform these functions was fought over in whispered corridors, argued across letters, held as a marker of influence and proximity. Women of ancient lineage stood at careful attention while a 15-year-old girl stood shivering in the morning cold, waiting for the correct hands to pass her the correct garment in the correct sequence. She was not permitted to shiver impatiently. She was not permitted to reach for the chemise herself. She was not permitted in the intimate ritual of dressing to be intimate. She had left the only language she knew and arrived in one she had learned imperfectly, in a country she had never seen, surrounded by people who had already formed their opinions of her before she walked through the door. The anti-Austrian faction at Versailles was not subtle about its hostility. It had a figurehead in the Comtesse du Barry, Louis XV's last official mistress, a woman of formidable political intelligence and equally formidable enemies. And it had a clear objective: to make the young Dauphine understand, in the 1,000 small registers of court behavior, that she was tolerated rather than welcomed. Whether she sat, who sat near her, who acknowledged her in passing, and who looked through her as though she were a fixture of the room rather than a person standing in it. All of it was currency. All of it was legible to every observer present. The court was a language, and its native speakers were fluent in cruelty. She learned it faster than they expected. The marriage was not consummated for 7 years. Louis Auguste was not a cruel man. He was a shy one, awkward in his own large body, more comfortable at a forge repairing locks than performing the rituals of royal magnificence. His intelligence was genuine. His social instincts had been poorly developed by a childhood spent in the shadow of a brilliant and domineering grandfather. And whatever the specific nature of the physical impediment that made the marriage impossible in its early years, the historians settle cautiously on a correctable condition that went unaddressed, because Louis was not a man who found vulnerability easy. It persisted. His brother-in-law, the Emperor Joseph II, would eventually make the journey from Vienna in 1777, speak to Louis with apparently remarkable frankness, and the problem would resolve itself with an almost anticlimactic abruptness shortly thereafter. 7 years. For 7 years, the sole diplomatic purpose for which Marie Antoinette had been delivered to France went unfulfilled, and the blame fell where it always fell at Versailles, on the woman. Her mother's letters arrived from Vienna with the regularity of official dispatches and roughly the warmth of official dispatches. Maria Theresa's correspondence to her daughter is one of the extraordinary documents of the 18th century. A mother writing to a child and a sovereign, writing to an instrument of state policy in the same sentences, and never quite able to separate the two. She inquired about the marriage with the directness of someone who regarded her daughter's intimate life as a matter of international concern, because she had been raised in a world where it was. She asked about Marie Antoinette's French, her reading, her court relationships, her comportment. She noted deficiencies. She prescribed corrections. She expressed love. To receive those letters in an unheated apartment at the end of a day of total performance, in a palace full of strangers who were waiting for her to fail at the one thing she had been sent here to accomplish. The particular quality of that loneliness is not difficult to imagine. It simply should not be forgotten. She built what she could. The Princess de Lamballe, gentle, loyal, constitutionally incapable of the court's more corrosive arithmetic, became the companion she trusted most in those early years. Later, Yolande de Polastron, the Duchess de Polignac, who brought something warmer and less calculated into the room than the palace air usually contained. These friendships were not ornamental. In an environment where every relationship carried a political coefficient, and every kindness could be assessed as either debt or investment, the women who chose to be simply present, without agenda, without the cold geometry of access, were not luxuries. They were what made the whole suffocating edifice survivable. She played the harpsichord. She patronized opera. Glark, whose Iphigenie on Olide she helped bring to the Paris stage with the kind of focused, intelligent advocacy that the myth of the frivolous queen would later have difficulty accommodating. She had taste. She had judgment. She had, beneath the powder and the performance and the elaborate architecture of the coiffure, a mind that noticed things and held them. The daughter arrived in December of 1778. Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, sturdy, watchful, her father's temperament already legible in her face. The court noted with the particular coldness of courts that the child was not a boy. In 1781, the Dauphin, Louis-Joseph, the heir. The room breathed differently after that, not warmly. Versailles did not do warmth, but differently. The question that had hung over her position for more than a decade, the question that had been asked in letters from Vienna and whispered in the corridors of Versailles and sharpened into pamphlets circulating in Paris, had at last been answered. She was no longer quite so exposed. She was not secure. She had lived at Versailles long enough to understand that security, for a woman in her position, was a concept that existed only in the past tense. But she had her children. She had the small private world she had constructed carefully from the improbable materials available to her. She had grown, from the frightened girl who had crossed a river island with nothing, into a woman of genuine intelligence, genuine warmth, and a harder-won resilience than the story her enemies were assembling would ever see fit to acknowledge. Beyond the gates, Paris was not the same city it had been when she arrived. It was harder now, louder in its dissatisfactions, more organized in its grievances. The harvests had been poor. The treasury was in a condition that Louis XV had bequeathed to Louis XVI the way a man passes a debt to his son, with studied cheerfulness and no forwarding address. Ideas that would have been dangerous to speak openly a decade earlier were being spoken openly, printed, distributed. She could not see all of it from inside the gilded rooms. What she could feel, the way you feel a change in pressure before the storm announces itself in rain, was something shifting in the ground beneath the palace's foundations. Something that did not yet have a name she could say plainly. She had learned so many things in the years since the Rhine. She had not yet learned to read this. The paint is dry on this chapter, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to portraits of the past. The next exhibit awaits.